Following the assassination, there was a questionable number of witnesses who died under mysterious circumstances. In total, there was an accumulation of over 50 witnesses that had died unconventionally. The Sunday Times reported that the odds against these witnesses being dead less than 4 years after the assassination was 100,000 trillion to 1. After being questioned by the Select Committee on Assassinations, the journalist retracted his statement, saying he made a careless journalistic mistake. The first death was Karen Kupchinet, only 6 days after President Kennedy's death. She was strangled to death and found by the police an estimated 2 days after being killed. The catch is that only a few days before Kennedy's assassination, a long-distance operator heard her screaming that President Kennedy was going to be killed. Her boyfriend, Andrew Preen, was a prime suspect, but he was never charged and the crime remains unsolved. Some contended that the conspirators murdered her in an attempt to scare off her father, Irv Kupchinet, who is a journalist, from writing on what he knew. Next, on December 2nd of 1963, one of JFK's close friends, Grant Stockdale, plummeted from the 13th floor of his office in Miami, Florida, without even leaving a suicide note. 4 days after the assassination, Stockdale flew to Washington to meet with John's brothers, Robert and Edward. Upon returning, he reportedly told multiple people that the world was closing in. On December 1st, only 1 day before his death, his attorney recalled him saying that there were people out to get him because he knew about the assassination. Gary Underhill followed on May 8th, 1964. Underhill had a conspiracy from the beginning that the CIA carried out the assassination, claiming Oswald was set up. His death was officially ruled as a suicide, but it is reported that the bullet entered his left ear, despite him being right-handed. 2 journalists, Bill Hunter of the Long Beach Press-Telegram and Jim Koth of the Dallas Times-Herald, interviewed George Senator, Ruby's roommate, who earlier that day had visited Jack Ruby in jail. It was then arranged for Hunter and Koth to search Ruby's apartment on the evening of November 24th, 1963. It has never been reported what the journalists have discovered there. On April 23rd, 1964, Hunter was fatally shot by policeman Creighton Wiggins in the press room of a Long Beach police station. Wiggins at first claimed that his gun misfired when he dropped it and tried to pick it up. However, he changed his story to him and the officer, Errol F. Greenleaf, playing a game of quick draw. However, Greenleaf testified that he had his back turned when the shooting took place. Both officers were convicted of murder and sentenced to 3 years of probation. 5 months later, on September 21st, the other journalist, Jim Koth's apartment was broken into and he was killed with a karate chop to the throat. No culprit was ever produced. Another case is recorded on the 21st of July in 1964 when Dr. Mary Sherman was stabbed in the heart, arm, leg, and stomach and had her laboratory set on fire. The case has never been solved. Sherman was working with David Ferrie on a secret CIA biological weapon in New Orleans. This was corroborated by Judith Baker, who claimed she was recruited to work with Dr. Mary Sherman on a secret CIA project aimed at ensuring Fidel Castro developed cancer. While in New Orleans, Baker accounts working closely with others involved in the plot, including Lee Harvey Oswald, David Ferrie, Clay Shaw, and Guy Bannister. She even includes that she began an affair with Oswald. Later, when the project was abandoned in September of '63, her and Oswald kept in touch when he was moved to Dallas. Once in Dallas, Oswald is thought to have been forced to join the plot to kill John F. Kennedy, which he believed was being orchestrated by Mafia leader Carlos Marcello and CIA agent David Atlee Phillips. Oswald reportedly told Baker that he would do his best to ensure Kennedy was not assassinated. After the assassination of Kennedy and the arrest of Oswald, Ferrie called Baker to warn her that she would be killed if she told anyone about what she knew. Next, on October 12, 1964, Mary Pinchot Meyer was shot dead while taking a stroll in Ohio. Her death appeared to be by a professional hitman because the bullets were fired at close range to the back of her head and into her heart. A nearby car mechanic saw the killer right after she was shot and described him to the police as a black man in a light jacket, dark slacks, and a dark cap standing over the body of a white woman. The police searched nearby the crime scene and arrested Raymond Crump, a black man, but the mechanic never confirmed the identity of Crump as the killer, and a murder weapon was never found. For these reasons, Crump was acquitted and the case remains unsolved. It was not announced until 1976, until James Truitt alerted the press to Meyer having an affair with JFK. He also included that before Mary had died, she told his wife, Ann Truitt, that she was keeping a diary about her relationship with JFK, and that if anything ever happened to her, that Ann was to take possession of her diary. At the time of Mary's death, Anne was in Tokyo, so she phoned home to Mary's sister, Antoinette, telling her it was of great importance that she retrieve the diary before someone else did. Antoinette and her husband, Ben Bradley, reported not going to look until the next morning. Her house was locked, but when they got inside, they found CIA counterintelligence chief James Angleton, who said he was also searching for Mary's diary. Angleton said he had also received a phone call from Ann Truitt, which his wife Cicely confirmed. But a later article states that Angletons arrived at Mary's house the previous night to attend a poetry reading, because they were not yet aware of her death. Antoinette found the diary and letters between the president and Mary a few days later in a metal box. She passed the contents of the box to Angleton, who claimed he had burnt the diary and the letters because they held information that could hurt the president's image. Winston Scott was the CIA's station chief in Mexico, and when he retired in 1969, he wrote a memoir about his time in the FBI, OSS, and the CIA. He completed the rough draft and planned a meeting with the CIA director for April 30th of 1971. However, 4 days before the scheduled meeting, Scott died of an apparent heart attack. Dorothy Kilgallen was a crime reporter for the New York Journal and obtained a private interview with Jack Ruby, which she proclaimed would help break the case wide open. Kilgallen had heard about the previous journalists, Hunter and Coates, so she turned over her notes of the interview to her friend, Margaret Smith. On November 8, 1965, Kilgallen was found dead in a reported suicide. It's said she had accidentally overdosed on barbiturates. Autopsy report shows that she had enough drugs in her to kill over 10 men. 2 days later, her friend holding on to her notes also died.
It is not so much as a co-worker that we miss Dorothy, though certainly she was a game player that was better than almost all the rest of us. It is really as a family that we are saddened by her absence. Good night, Steve.
Good night, Arlene. The fact that we didn't get any of the first three contestants tonight, John, establishes, as Arlene has indicated, that even just purely as a game player, Dorothy is very dearly missed. But of course, that's not a very important consideration. She's missed as a human being. The world knows her as a very brilliant woman, very quick-minded and very intelligent, the writer of a very fine newspaper column. But we all think it's more important that she was also a very fine wife and a very fine mother and a fine human being, and we miss her in those capacities.
Well, a lot of people knew Dorothy as a very tough game player. Others knew her as a tough newspaper woman. When she went after a story, nothing could get in her way. But we got to know her as a human being, a more lovable, softer, loyal person never lived, and we're going to miss her terribly.
Guy Bannister was one of the prime witnesses in Jim Garrison's investigation in the conspiracy to kill Kennedy. Within 10 days after the final Warren Commission hearings, Guy was found dead due to coronary thrombosis. His partner, Hugh Ward, also died shortly after while piloting an airplane, which crashed in Mexico. David Ferry was Garrison's most important witness to his case against Clay Shaw. Ferry knew that Jack Ruby and Clay Shaw had previously worked for mafia boss Carlos Marcello. He died of an alleged brain hemorrhage on February 22, 1967. The same day and hour that David Ferry died, his CIA paymaster and close friend, Eladio Duvali, was also killed in Miami with a shot to his heart and a machete splitting his skull. He was intended to be called as a witness in Garrison's investigation, just like Ferry. Clay Shaw's death was one of the strangest of all. He died on August 14, 1974. The night of his death, one of Shaw's neighbors witnessed a few men carrying a stretcher, carrying a sheet-covered body into Shaw's house right through the front door. The neighbor proceeded to call the coroner, who then launched investigators into Sean's home. By the time they had arrived, the men and the body were gone. The very next day, it was revealed that Sean had already been buried in his own hometown of Kentwood. On the day of the assassination, Robert D. Craig was on duty in Dallas.
Where were you on the day of the assassination of John Kennedy?
I was standing out in front of the sheriff's office, which at that time was at 505 Main Street. They've moved it since then, but It was at 505 Main Street, directly in front of the front door.
Was the motorcade passing that area at that time?
No, we had to wait about 15 minutes before the motorcade arrived, but the sheriff had sent us out there that early to wait.
Were you merely a spectator or were you on duty?
Well, no, I was on duty, but a couple hours before Kennedy was to arrive, the sheriff called us in, what I call the street people, the plainclothesmen, the detectives, and he instructed us that we were to stand out in front and in no way take part in the security of that motorcade, that we were merely spectators and nothing more.
Did that seem unusual to you?
It did to me at the time because there were so many people around and so few Dallas police officers. This is one of the first things I noticed was the lack of Dallas police officers. Try to keep the people back. The president came by and they made the right turn on to Houston Street. And, I'll say, a few seconds later, give them time to get to Elm Street and make a left, I heard what I call a report, a gunshot. And I said, oh my God. And I turned and started toward Houston Street, running just as hard as I could. And I was probably 15 steps from Houston Street. And before I reached those 15 steps, I heard two more reports.
Then you arrived at Elm Street?
Right.
Okay, what did you see?
Well, there was a Dallas police officer running up the grassy knoll to the picket fence. So I immediately assumed the motorcade had left by then. And I immediately assumed that he knew something about the shots or he wouldn't have been headed for the picket fence. So I followed him.
Were you aware the president had been hit?
Not at that time. Now, people were mentioning the president was shot, and someone else said a Secret Service agent was shot, and there were just stories flying all over. But my interest was to get behind that picket fence because that's where that Dallas police officer was headed. And he was in the motorcade. He was a traffic officer. I worked in that area for, probably 7, 8 minutes, maybe, something like that, until I ran on to Mr. and Mrs. Arnold Rowland. Now, Mr. Rowland told me that 15 minutes before the motorcade arrived, he saw two men on the 6th floor of the school book depository. Now, one was a white male in the east corner of the 6th floor with a rifle. The other one was a colored male at the west end of the 6th floor, pacing back and forth. Although I called Captain Fritz at his office and gave him a description of the man I saw get into the Rambler. And he told me, and I quote him, "It sounds like the suspect we have in custody. Come on up and take a look at him." So I went out and got in my unmarked car and drove to the City Hall, went directly to Captain Fritz's office. And we went into Captain Fritz's inner office, and the man was sitting in a chair behind a desk. And there was another gentleman. I assumed he was one of Fritz's people because he had the white cowboy hat on, which was the trademark at that time of the Dallas Homicide Bureau. And Fritz turned to me and said, "Is this the man you saw?" I said, "Yes." And it was. It was. So he turned to the suspect and he said, "This man saw you leave." At which time the suspect became a little excited. And he said, "I told you people I did." And Fritz said, "Now take it easy, son," talking to the suspect. He said, "We're just trying to find out what happened." He said, "What about the car?" I didn't say station wagon. He said, "What about the car?" at which time the suspect leaned forward and put both hands up on the desk and said, "That station wagon belongs to Mrs. Payne. Don't try to drag her into this." Then he leaned back and very disgustedly said, "Everybody will know who I am now." Now, this was not a brag. I know it's been blown up to be a brag in the Warren Commission. This was not a brag. This was a man that
he was
catch in a
embarrassed
building
about
at night, you know, after it's locked. This is like somebody was trying to steal something and you catch him at it.
He was embarrassed about it.
Or disgusted that he had blown his cover or been caught or something. You know, it wasn't a brag. It had been determined that the shots came from the southeast window. How, I don't know. The Dallas police were saying this, so we immediately went there. And Deputy Sheriff Luke Mooney was with me when we found the shells. We found 3 hulls beside the window on the 6th floor. And they were laying 3 in a row, not more than an inch.
This was brass, the 3 spent cartridges.
3 spent cartridges. They were lying 3 in a row, not more than an inch apart, all pointing in the same direction. Of course, I didn't touch them. They hadn't been photographed or fingerprinted or anything. I didn't touch those. And there was a lunch sack, very small, brown paper lunch sack up there. Had some chicken bones in it. And there was a soda bottle sitting on a box. And we began then to search for a weapon. And we started toward, everybody took a different direction. And Deputy Sheriff Boone and myself just happened to head for the northwest corner of the building. And Boone was ahead of me by about 8 feet. And there were a stack of boxes just at the head of the stairwell going downstairs. And Boone looked over into it and said, "Here it is. Here's the rifle." So I immediately went over beside him and looked over, and there was a rifle. But we didn't touch it until Captain Fritz and Lieutenant Day from the ID department of the Dallas Police Department got there. Now, Captain Fritz was Chief of Homicide, and Lieutenant Day was from the Identification Bureau. They got there and took some pictures of the rifle. And then I believe Day pulled the rifle out and handed it to Captain Fritz, who held it up by the, had a strap on it. He held it up by the strap and asked if anyone knew what kind of rifle it was. Well, by this time, Deputy Constable Seymour Weitzman had joined us. And Weitzman was a gun buff. He had a sporting goods store at one time. He was very good with weapons. And he said it looked like a Mauser. And he walked over to Fritz. And Captain Fritz was holding the rifle up in the air. And I was standing next to Weitzman, who was standing next to Fritz. And we weren't any more than 6 or 8 inches from the rifle. And stamped right on the barrel of the rifle was 7.65 Mauser. And that's when Weitzman said it is a Mauser and pointed to the 7.65 Mauser stamp on the barrel.
Mauser German-made rifle with the sniper scope sights that was found on the German-built Mauser with the sniper scope that was used to kill President Kennedy.
7.65 Mauser, German rifle, familiar to those who served in World War II.
Place. It's a 7.65 Mauser, German-made Army rifle, telescopic sight, and 1 shell left in the chamber. 3 spent shells have been found nearby, and apparently they're hooking this as the as the murder weapon.
Sniper scope, high-powered Mauser
The Dallas
rifle.
Sheriff's Department said the rifle had been found in a staircase on the 5th floor of a building near the scene of the assassination. It was a 7.65 Mauser.
From Dallas, we have heard that a definite identification has been made of the type of rifle used in the assassination of President Kennedy. It was not a Mauser, as has been reported through most of yesterday and today, but an Italian Manlicher Carcanto, manufactured in the Italian town of Carcanto.
Craig and Weitzman were asked to testify before the Warren Commission, and although Weitzman changed his stance on finding a Mannlicher Carcano rather than the 7.65 Mauser, Craig refused. Craig also testified about seeing Lee Harvey Oswald get into the station wagon 15 minutes after the shooting. But this was ignored by the Warren Commission because it showed that there was more than one person involved. In 1967, Craig was called to New Orleans to testify as a witness in the trial of K.I.A. From then on, he suffered numerous murder attempts. He was first shot at while walking to a car park, but the bullet only grazed his head. In 1973, he had his car forced off a mountain road by another car. The next year survived another Texas shooting. Then in 1975, he was seriously wounded when his car engine exploded. One day, he told his friends that the mafia was going to kill him, and then he was found dead May 15th, 1975. The cause of death was ruled as a suicide. William Wheatley claimed to have been the driver of the cab that Oswald used after leaving the book depository.
Well, he just looked like an ordinary working man. He was small, had on gray work clothes, brown shirt and a silver stripe and a work jacket. He said he got in, said he wanted to go to 500 block North Beckley. So I come on the way we're going now and turned right on this signal light onto Jackson Street. I come on here to Austin Street, turn left on this light to Austin, to a wood.
What did you talk to him about as you came around here?
Well, I didn't talk very much. I didn't know the president was shot at that time, and the police cars and sirens was running all around this end of town, making a lot of noise, so all I said to him was, I wonder what the hell all the commotion is in this end of town. He didn't answer me. So I didn't say any more to him. I figured he was one of these people that didn't want to talk. He had something else on his mind.
What time did you log the fact that this man got in your cab?
I believe it was somewhere between 12:15 and 12:45. I never log exactly on a minute. It's always approximate time.
Well, now, you say that when he got in back there at the bus station and you started across here, about how long did it take you to make this run?
Well, approximately somewhere between 6.5 and 8 minutes.
Mr. Whaley, when you went up to the Warren Commission, what were they more interested in than anything else? Any particular area of your testimony?
Well, yes, sir, in the time element and what I put out on my sheet. They want to know why I approximated my time, and I explained to them that I put the trips down as every 15 minutes. That's 4 an hour, which is usually the run of it. You can't put them down exactly to the minute because you'd have to stop on in traffic or be writing while you're moving, and that's dangerous. So I just approximate mine. It runs on the 15 minutes.
Now, he lived right here in this block.
Right here, in the same block, right here, 1018.
Which one, the house right there?
That house right there.
But he didn't say anything about getting out.
No, sir, and he wasn't looking at it as we passed. And about along right in here, he asked me, he said, he didn't ask me, he just said, this'll do fine right here. But the cars were parked like this, and I waited till I passed the last car and pulled over to the curb, which was the intersection of Neely and North Beckley.
And did you tell him how much the fare was, or what?
No, sir, I didn't. He just looked at the meter, and it's 95 cents. He handed me $1, opened the door and got out, walked around in front of the cab and across the street, and that's the last I saw him. I went on about my business.
In 1965, he was involved in an auto accident and became the first Dallas cabbie to be killed on duty since 1937. James R. Worrell had been present in Dealey Plaza at the time of the president's assassination. He claimed to have heard a fourth shot and reported to the Warren Commission that he had seen a man wearing a dark-colored sport coat run out of the back door of the depository. He died from an accident involving a car and a motorcycle in November 1966. Domingo Benavides witnessed the Tippit murder allegedly committed by Oswald. However, Benavides and other eyewitnesses called that Tippit's killer looked nothing similar to Oswald. Then, Benavides began receiving numerous death threats. He only changed his story that the killer resembled Oswald after his brother, Edward, who looked very much like Domingo, and was killed in a bar fight, which was suspected as a case of mistaken identity. Prior to JFK coming to Dallas, 2 workers of Jack Ruby threw stripper Rose Charami out of a speeding car and abandoned her there. Charami claimed to know of a plan to kill the president, telling multiple doctors and nurses. Charami was killed in a hit-and-run in 1965. Mr. and Mrs. de Mohrenschildt were friends with both Lee Harvey Oswald and Jacqueline Kennedy prior to the assassination. Mr. George de Mohrenschildt was scheduled to meet with an investigator from the House Assassinations Committee, but allegedly shot himself that day before ensuing with the meeting. Miss Jeannie de Mohrenschildt never believed in her husband's suicide and was afraid for her own life at the time. She made the statement, "They may get me too, but I'm not afraid. It is time somebody looked into this thing." Only weeks after contacting the author of The Killing of a President, Jeannie also died. Joseph Milter was an ultra-right-wing supporter who was present in Dealey Plaza the day of the assassination. Only a couple hours prior to the assassination of Kennedy, Milter placed a call to Willie Somerset in Miami saying, "I don't think you will ever see your boy Kennedy in Miami again." Early February of 1974, Milter's Coleman heating stove exploded, leaving his legs with severe third-degree burns. He had undergone treatment and was reportedly healing well when he died on February 28th, with the cause of death on his death certificate listed as severe third-degree burns to both his lower extremities and 40% of his body surface. Tessa Norton, also known as Karen Bennett Carlin, and Little Lynn worked at Jack Ruby's business as a stripper. On November 24th, 1963, she made a call to Jack Ruby pleading for funds. Ruby then went downtown to wire her money before heading over to the police headquarters to shoot Lee Harvey Oswald on national television. Norton's request of money would have given Ruby a reason to be close enough to the headquarters to move in when necessary. Norton was supposedly shot to death in August the next year, although no death certificate exists. Currently, it is still unknown whether she is dead or alive.
They say that they don't want to be involved in the Jack Ruby in any way, nor do they want any trouble, and they don't want the investigators coming around.
Have you been bothered with investigators at all since the Jack Ruby trial?
Quite a bit.
What sort of questions have they been asking you, and where are the investigators from?
The investigators are from Dallas and Fort Worth, also the Warren Commission, and the questions are, I guess, just about the same as they ask anyone, is, did you know Jack Ruby, and so on and so on.
What kind of a man was Jack Ruby, or is Jack Ruby?
Well, I believe he was a nice employer to me. I believe he's a highly nervous person. I don't really like to give my own opinion of what I really believe.
Head mafia figures Charles Nicoletti, Sam Giancana, and John Roselli all died violent deaths before they could testify before the House Assassinations Committee about the connections between the CIA's assassination plots against Fidel Castro and the assassination of JFK. For example, Nicoletti was shot 3 times in the head before his car was set on fire on March 28th of 1977. Jack Ruby, the shooter of Oswald, was suspected to have associations with the organized crime leaders. He survived until June 7th, 1964. The Warren Commission had been interviewing Ruby in the Dallas County Jail, where Ruby pleaded for hours with Earl Warren and others to be taken out of Dallas because he knew he wasn't safe. He said once taken to safety, he could reveal everything he knew. His pleas were ignored, and Ruby is quoted to have said, "I won't be around for you to come and question me again." Ruby was granted a new trial with Judge Joe Brown, but Brown died within the next few days, and Ruby died in jail before a second trial could take place. Ruby reportedly died of a blood clot and cancer which he believed was caused with a carcinogenic substance.